Now, before we get into lesson 9.4, here's another question for you. All right? So far, you've learned 2 different ways to solve a quadratic equation. Can somebody give me one way? Graphing is one way. What is the second way that you have learned to solve a quadratic equation? Square roots, all right? You just did that on your test yesterday. So, you've learned to solve a quadratic equation by graphing, and you've learned to solve a quadratic equation by using square roots. Today, in lesson 9.4, we are going to learn to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. Now, the essential question says, how can you use completing the square to solve a quadratic equation? These are the steps to completing the square for the expression x squared plus bx. Why is this an expression and not an equation? What's missing?
There's no equal sign.
There's no equal sign, all right? But do you see the x squared? Here's the x squared. This makes it quadratic. Now, I'm going to keep this simple. It says you are going to add plus and a blank. There's nothing for you to fill in this blank. We are literally going to, on our paper, put a plus sign and a blank. Then we're going to find b, divide it by 2, and square the number. Now, you should know this. B is the coefficient of x. So every time we're going to go find the number in front of x, we're going to divide it by 2, and we're going to square it. And then we're going to add the number that we find to the x squared plus bx. So essentially, we're taking the number we find and we're putting it into the blank. All right, so here we go. Example number 1. Complete the square for the expression, then factor the trinomial. So we're going to be factoring again today, but we'll get to that here in just a second. Letter A says x squared plus 10x. Letter A says x squared plus 10x. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to add a plus sign and we're going to add a blank. Now, what is the value of b in this problem? 10. So we're going to take right here over to the side, we're going to take 10. We're going to divide it by 2. What does 10 divided by 2 equal? 5. All right, go ahead and put that 5 in parentheses, and then we are going to square it. What is 5 squared? 25. So 25 is the number that's going in the blank. Now, we've completed the square. But now we're supposed to factor it. All right, so let's talk about factoring. Let's ask ourselves the questions that we're supposed to ask. Number 1, is there a GCF? So when you look at the problem now, is there a GCF? You sure?
No.
No, the leading coefficient is a 1. So if the leading coefficient is a 1, there is no GCF. All right? Question number 2, what kind of polynomial do we now have? Trinomial. There are 3 terms. All right? Is there a shortcut? Now, there's only one possible shortcut for a perfect square trinomial. I just gave you the answer. Is this a perfect square trinomial?
Yes.
Yes, because the first term and the third term are perfect squares, and the second sign is positive. Now, guess what? If you do this correctly, you are creating a perfect square trinomial every single time. So every single time you're asked to factor, you're going to be factoring with the shortcut. All right, now let's review the shortcut. How many sets of parentheses are there
0
when it's a perfect square trinomial? How many sets of parentheses? 1. All right, so everybody put down 1. That 1 set of parentheses is raised to what power? The second. The sign in the binomial is going to come from where?
The second.
Not the second. The second sign has to be positive for it to be a perfect square trinomial. The sign in our answer comes from the first sign in the trinomial, which is a what? Plus. Now, how do we find the 2 terms we need for our answer? Square root the first term and we square root the third term in order to find the 2 terms for our answer. So the square root of x squared is, and the square root of 25 is 5. Now, do you see 5 up on the screen already?
Yes.
Yes, so guess what? Instead of having to think about the square root of the third term, you can actually go back to the number that you squared, and that is the number and the sign that should be in your answer. Why is it also the sign? Because that's what kind of a 5?
Positive.
And what is in the parentheses of your answer? A plus 5. All right? So that's just another way that you can quickly find your answer. But that is as far as we go because it's an expression. We have factored like we've been asked. Get letter B. Again, go ahead and add your plus and your blank. What is the B value this time?
4.
Careful. It's a negative 4. We're going to divide it by 2, and that equals negative 2. Put that negative 2 in parentheses, and what do we do with it? We square it. All right, what is negative 2 squared? Careful.
Positive 2. Oh.
It is a negative, listen, it is a negative 2 times a negative 2. A negative times a negative is a positive. Now listen, remember, it's going to be positive every single time. We are creating a perfect square trinomial every single time. So the number that you square will always be a positive number. All right, now let's factor. How many sets of parentheses?
1.
Raised to what power?
2.
What's the sign this time?
Minus.
And what are my terms? X and 2. Good. Remember, we're either going to take the square root of the first term and the third term, or we're going to go right back here and use that negative 2 that we squared. Okay? We still got to find the x, but then it's minus 2. And this is our factored answer. Work letter C on your own. Letter C. We add a plus and a blank. All right. What is the b value of letter C? 7, and we divide that by 2. Now, we're going to leave it improper. So, essentially, we're taking 7 halves and we're doing what with it?
Dividing it.
Leave it.
No, that's the number that we're squaring, right? Because we're not doing anything. We're not making it improper. It can't reduce. So, we're taking 7 halves, and that's the number that we are squaring. So, what do we get when we square 7 halves?
3.5.
No decimals. Remember? No decimals. Okay. I just said we weren't going to make it improper and it can't reduce. So leave it improper. Or we're not going to make it a mixed number. 49 over 4. You have to square the numerator and you have to square the denominator. All right, let's factor it. How many sets of parentheses?
1.
Raised to the second power. The sign will be, and the terms will be, first term is x, second term is 7 halves. Very good. Again, you can take the square root of the first term, square root of the third term, or take the square root of the first term and go back to the number that you squared. Now, we're going to learn the steps to solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So now we're going to be solving equations. All right? Now, this looks like a lot of information, but here's the good news. The first 2 things are just questions that we're going to ask before we start to complete the square. All right, I like to give you questions so you have a place to start and you don't just try to dive into a problem that you have no clue what you're doing. So here's question number 1. Is the constant on the right side of the equation? This could also say, is the constant on a side by itself? See, for months now, you've been factoring, and so you've been having to bring everything to one side and set it equal to 0. All that changes now that we're completing the square. The constant actually has to be on a side by itself. So that's the first question. The second question, is the leading coefficient a 1? You cannot complete the square until the leading coefficient is a 1. So if your answer is no, it's not, take the leading coefficient, whatever it is, and divide every single term by that number. All right? Once these 2 questions have been answered, now we begin to complete the square. Look at step number 1. Add a plus and a blank to both sides. Now that's the only difference, okay? I want you to highlight the word both. Since we now are working and solving an equation, there's an equal sign, right? So there's 2 sides. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So we're going to add that plus and that blank to both sides of the equation. Look at the next step. Find b divided by 2 and square the number. We just did that. Then add the number to both sides of the equation. So again, we're filling in the blank with that number on both sides. Factor, the next step, the left side of the equation. Now really, the trinomial could be on the left side or the right side, okay? But the point is we are factoring the trinomial. And again, if you have done the first 2 steps correctly, it's going to be a perfect square trinomial. So we're going to factor just like we did in the first example. Here's the new thing for now. We're solving the equation for x using square roots. Except that's not really new because you did it on your test yesterday. All right, so now we have to go one step further than factoring, and we have to actually solve the equation for x by using the square roots. All right, now you'll notice in example 1 it says for letter A, see the flow chart. The flow chart did not get printed, so just go to the back side of your notes. Everybody flip over to the back side of your notes, go halfway down and write example 2 A. And here is the problem. All right? You don't have to write out the instructions. Just write example 2, letter A, and then write x squared minus 2x equals 3. Question number 1. Is the constant on the right side of the equation? So looking at letter A, is the constant on a side by itself?
Yes.
Yes. Question number 2. Is the leading coefficient a 1?
Yes.
Yes. The coefficient of x squared is the leading coefficient, and there's nothing there, so it's an understood 1. So we go straight into step number 1, which is to add the plus and the blank to both sides. So you're going to rewrite the problem, x squared minus 2x plus a blank equals 3 plus the blank. Now, how do we find the number that goes in the blank? What is our b value this time?
-2.
So -2 divided by 2 equals,
1.
careful, -1, and I do what with the -1? Square. So what's -1 squared?
1.
+1. So there's a +1 that goes in both of my blanks. Now, we're going to factor the trinomial, factor the left side of the equation. How do I factor it? How many parentheses are in my answer?
2.
Careful.
1.
Remember, this is a perfect square trinomial if we've done it correctly. So there's one set of parentheses raised to the second power. What's our sign? Negative. And what are our two terms? X and 1. Again, take the square root of the first term, the square root of the third term. Or go back to the number you squared, and there's your sign and your number for your answer. But this time we have to keep going because there's equals. Do the math. What's 3 plus 1? 4. All right? So that brings us to our last step, which says solve the equation for x using square roots. Now, the squared piece is isolated, so we've got to get rid of the square. How do you undo something that's been squared? Square root. And what we do to one side, again, we must do to the other. So we're going to square or take the square root of both sides. Now, remember, we put the radical into the problem, which means we also have to put what into the problem? The little plus or minus, okay? What is the square root of x minus 1 squared?
X minus 1.
Good. X minus 1, and it equals plus or minus. What's the square root of 4? 2. Now, have we solved for x? No. How do we get x by itself? We add 1. And remember, this should get us two separate answers. We have x equals a +2 plus 1, and x equals a -2 plus 1. What is 2 plus 1?
3.
Oh, good. And what is -2 plus 1? So if we were to graph this quadratic equation, it would cross the x-axis at 3 and the x-axis at -1. Letter B. First question. Is the constant on the right side of the equation?
Yeah, no.
No. What is the constant this time?
27.
So how do we move it to the other side?
Subtract.
We subtract 27 from both sides. The constant has to be on a side by itself. So 3g squared minus 24g. Now 27 minus 27 is 0, and we don't have to bring down the 0, but I am going to leave the space there because I know what's coming. I am going to be adding a plus and a blank in a minute, so I'm just going to leave the space there. It equals, what's 0 minus 27? -27. All right, question number 2. Is the leading coefficient a 1? No. What is it?
3.
So we take the 3 and we divide every single term by that 3, including the -27 on the other side. All right, what is 3g squared divided by 3? G squared. What is -24g divided by 3? -8g. Again, I'm leaving that space. And what's -27 divided by, I don't know, all of a sudden I have a -3. It's just +3. What's -27 divided by 3? -9. All right. Now I can begin to complete the square. What's the first thing I do to complete the square?
Add plus
A
blank.
plus and a blank on both sides. All right. Carson, how do I find the number for the blank this time? I take my b value of -8, divide it by 2, and what does that equal? -4. And what do I do with that -4? Good. I square it, and what does that give me? Close. 16. So I'm going to add 16 to both sides. All right. What do we do to the left side of the problem, Andrew?
Square root.
All right, but you're telling me the process. What is the actual thing that we're doing to the trinomial? Look at your steps if you need to. It starts with an F. We are going to factor the trinomial. All right, so talk me through factoring the trinomial, Andrew. Tell me about my parentheses first, all that. Pretend I don't know what I'm writing down or doing.
Okay.
One set of parentheses raised to what power? The second, okay.
And then put a negative.
Okay, my first sign in my trinomial is minus, so I drop that down. And then what? Root of g squared and get g?
And then square root negative 8. Or no.
Take the square root of the first term and the square root of the third term, the 16, and get what?
You get
4. Good. And again, once I have the g, I can go over here to the number that I squared, and I see the -4, the -4, and that's what should be in my factored answer. Now, it equals what? What's -9 plus 16? 7. All right, now I got to keep going because I got to solve for g. So what is, Pearson, my next step?
Square root what's in parentheses?
Okay, just the left side?
Both sides.
Both sides. I take the square root of both sides. And Pearson, I put the radical in, so I also put what into the problem? We also add the plus or the minus. So the square root of g minus 4 squared is, everyone, g minus 4, and it equals plus or minus. Now, is the square root of 7 a perfect square? No, and it also can't be simplified with upside down division, but we don't have to do that this time because we're using our calculators. Now, grab your calculators because calculator is very particular. If you do not put this in correctly, it'll just keep telling you error and you'll get more and more frustrated. All right, so here's how this goes. Well, first of all, am I even ready to use the calculator yet? No, because I got to get g by itself by doing what? Adding the 4, all right? We can't combine a radical and a number, so we have g equals the positive square root of 7 plus 4. We also have to solve g equals the negative square root of 7 plus 4. So you can write down your two separate equations. All right, now on your calculator, you don't have a radical button, you have an x squared button. So on the far left, if you have the right calculator, it's on the far left. Find that x squared button, and above it, printed on the calculator, should be that radical sign. So you got to hit the second button, hit the second at the top, then hit the x squared button, and does the radical show up on your screen? It should. Yes. Okay. Now we type in the number that is under the radical, which in this case is a 7. Close the parenthesis. Okay? Use the parenthesis button, the right one, and close it. Then hit the plus 4. Now the directions say round your solution to the nearest hundredth if necessary. All right, how many decimal places is 100? 2. So looking at your answer, your first g equals what?
6.64.
Careful.
6.65.
Good. We're rounding the 4. Since the number to the right of it is a 5, the 4 rounds up to a 5. So your first answer is 6 65 hundredths. All right, clear your calculator. Don't try to just keep going. Hit clear. Then it's a negative square root of 7. So at the bottom near the equal button, there is a little minus sign in parentheses. That's your negative sign. So hit the negative. Then second, x squared. There's your little radical again. 7 is under the radical. Close the parenthesis and add 4. So what is your second g value?
1.35.
If you round correctly, it's 1 35 hundredths. So that means if we were to graph this parabola, it would cross the x-axis at 6 65 hundredths and 1 35 hundredths. Go back to the front and work letter C on your own. All right, question number 1. Is the constant on the right side of the equation?
Yes.
Is the leading coefficient a 1?
No.
Yes.
Yes.
So we get to go straight into solving or completing the square. So what is the first thing that you did?
You would add the plus.
Good. So I bring down m squared plus 12m, and I add the plus and the blank. It equals negative 8. I add the plus and the blank. Maya, how do I find the number for the blank this time? Your b value, which is what?
12.
12. You divide it by, and it gives you, what do you do with that 6? And you get 36. So both blanks we fill in 36. All right, JD, what are we doing to the trinomial on the left? Factoring the trinomial, you told me to bring down the parentheses and do what with it?
Put in your sign.
Oh, hold
You
on.
gotta put it to the second.
Good. We got to raise it to the second power. Okay, bring down your sign. What's your sign going to be?
Positive, because it's the first sign.
Good. The first sign in the trinomial is a plus, so
Take the square root of m squared,
which is,
m,
okay?
and then bring down 36.
Be careful. To factor a perfect square trinomial, I take the square root of the first term and the square root of the third term. So I got to take the square root.
6.
There you go. Or remember, go back to the number you squared. That's a positive 6. So plus 6 is what should be in your answer. It also equals, though, negative 8 plus 36, which is what? 28. Awesome. All right. What's our next step, Tyler? Take the square root of both sides. And Tyler, if we put the radical into the problem, we also have to put what?
The radical on the other side.
Okay. And we also have to put in what sign?
Plus and minus.
Plus or minus. Very good. All right. What is the square root of m plus 6 squared? M plus 6, and it equals plus or minus. Can we do anything? Is 28 a perfect square? No. So we're going to keep it. We're not going to do upside down division this time. Now, we need to get m by itself. So how do we get m by itself?
Oh, you do a square.
You add
Subtract 6.
You subtract 6 from both sides. All right? So we have m equals, we have a positive square root of 28 minus 6. And we have m equals a negative square root of 28 minus 6. So grab those calculators again and be very careful. All right, I'll talk you through it one more time. Second, x squared button will give you the radical. 28 is the number under the radical this time. Close the parenthesis, subtract 6. Round to the nearest hundredth, what do you get?
Negative 31. Right.
Try again. It is negative. Your number is going to be negative. Mason?
Is it negative 0.71?
It is. It's negative 71 hundredths. All right, that's the first answer. All right, clear it and do it again. This time it's negative square root of 28. So hit that little negative in the parentheses down at the bottom of your calculator. Second, hit that x squared button. Again, 28 is what goes in there. Close the parenthesis, subtract 6. So m equals what? Negative 11 and 29 hundredths. Very good. Again, if we were to graph this, it would cross the x-axis. This parabola would cross at negative 71 hundredths and the x-axis at negative 11 and 29 hundredths. That brings us to example number 3. So go back to the back of your notes again. Now, this says write the equation in vertex form by completing the square. So we're going to continue to complete the square, which means our steps are not going to change. Here's the difference, though. We're no longer solving the equation, but we're putting it in vertex form. Now, you learned vertex form when I was out. So does anybody remember vertex form? Start you off. It's y equals x minus h squared plus k. Remember, h and k could be pulled out, and they were the vertex of your parabola. So this is vertex form. Everyone needs to write it down because no one remembered it, all right? So put it in your notes next to where it says vertex form. So this is encouraging because we don't have to go all the way to the end and solve. We get to stop once it's in vertex form. However, you also notice there's now a y in the problem. So you'll notice my little note says leave y on the side with the constant. So we're still going to move the constant away from the x squared and the x, but now it's going to sit on a side with the y, and that's okay. All right, so with that in mind, look at letter A. All right, is there a constant in letter A that we need to move? Is the constant on a side by itself? No. What's the constant that we need to move? 4. How do we move it? We subtract it, all right? So now it's just sitting over there with the y. That's okay. We can't do anything but bring both of those down. So y minus 4. I'm going to go ahead and leave a space because I know what's coming. And I bring down x squared minus 4x. Question 2, is my leading coefficient a 1? Yes. All right, so I'm ready to complete the square. What do I do first? Plus and a blank, and I'm going to do it to both sides. How do I find the number for the blank? Take my b term of negative 4, divide it by,
2.
which gives me,
2.
careful,
Oh,
negative 2. And what do I do with the negative 2? Which gives me 4, positive 4. So I add 4 to both sides, okay? So what is negative 4 plus 4? 0. Do I need to write down a 0? No, I do not. So y equals, now what am I supposed to do to the trinomial on the right?
Square.
Starts with an F again. I got to factor it, all right? How do I factor it? One set of parentheses, raised to what power? The sign will be negative. The first term will be,
Y.
careful, x, the square root of the first term, and the second term will be 2. Square root of 4, okay? It's a 2. But if you go and check, yes, we squared a negative 2, so make sure there's minus 2 or negative 2 in your answer. Now, is this vertex form? Because look what I say up here. It says, at the end, solve for y. But if I look at my problem, is y already by itself?
Yes.
Then is it in vertex form?
Yes.
Yes, it is. My k just happens to be a 0 this time, and I don't have to write it down. But that is vertex form, and that is as far as you have to go. All right. Is the constant on the right side of the equation? No. How do you move it? And what is it? And how do you move it? Okay, it's a negative 2, and you add it to both sides. Very good. So we just bring down the y plus 2. I'm going to leave a space, and it equals x squared minus 2x. Was the leading coefficient 1?
Yes.
So I go ahead and start completing the square by doing what?
Divide your b.
Not yet.
You add
Good. Your plus
Plus minus.
and your blank. All right, now JD,
Then you take your b term and divide it by
what is my b term?
2.
Careful. Every number has a sign. The sign's directly in front of it. Look right here. This is your b term, right? So it's what kind of? It's a negative 2, and you divide it by 2, which gives you what?
Negative 1
Good. And what do I do with negative 1? Square. What is negative 1 squared? Positive 1. Good. On the left side, I have y plus 1 equals 3. So we have y plus 3 equals. What are we doing to the right side or the trinomial? Factoring it. Good. How many sets of parentheses? Raised to the sign is, first term is, second term is. Good. We took the square root of the first term, the square root of the third term, or we went and looked at the number that we squared. Are we done? Is this? No. We have to end, at the end we have to solve for y. So how do we get y by itself? Subtract 3. Can we combine x minus 1 squared and negative 3? No, they're not like terms, but which one has to come down first?
Wait, no.
The squared binomial or the constant? Which one? Good. It has to be in vertex form. So we got to bring down the x minus 1 squared, then the minus 3. This is vertex form, and that is your final answer. That is lesson 9.4.